Susan Jennings. I'm Executive Director of the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions in Yellow Springs, Ohio. This webcast is part of a series of interviews that we're conducting with leaders across the planet about the coronavirus and how this pandemic has exposed fragilities in our systems and also opened up opportunities for rapid change. This morning, we're speaking with Dr. John Ikerd from his home in Fairfield, Iowa. John was born on a dairy farm in Missouri. He received his doctorate from the University of Missouri, and he also served as an extension agent and extension director at 3 universities across the South. In the 1980s, as a result of the farm crisis, John had a little bit of an awakening about the kinds of things he was teaching farmers in the extension service, and he started researching and writing about sustainability and sustainable food systems, something he's been doing for the past 4 decades. Since his retirement, he's written 6 books. Among them are Sustainable Capitalism, A Matter of Common Sense, Small Farms and Real Farms, Sustaining People Through Agriculture, and Crisis and Opportunity, Sustainability in American Agriculture. You can see from these titles that John has both an interest in agriculture, sustainable agriculture, but also has thought deeply about economics and the intersection of economics and agriculture. Most recently, he's been focused on the concept of deep sustainability. So we're really interested in talking to John about the past and an historical perspective on what's happening now, as well as his thoughts for the future of agriculture and maybe the future of capitalism. So thank you for joining us this morning, John.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be a part of your series and to share my ideas with the people that watch it.
Great, thank you. Well, John actually spoke at a peak oil conference that we had in Yellow Springs quite a few years ago, and was scheduled to speak at a conference on growing green that we had scheduled for March of this year, which unfortunately was canceled. But I'm interested, we were thinking in as little as a month or 6 weeks ago that trying to convince people or talking to people about the fragility of our food system was kind of a hard sell in agricultural America. And now I think we're thinking quite differently about our food systems. And I wonder if you could just maybe talk to us a little bit about the fragilities that have been exposed regionally, locally, nationally, and maybe even internationally as a result of the coronavirus.
Yeah, probably the thing that comes to mind for most people most quickly is the news programs that have been carrying about disruptions in the meat processing and in animal agricultural sectors, like here in the state of Iowa and then neighboring states of South Dakota and areas around here where we have these large meat packing plants. In fact, most of the confirmed cases of the coronavirus or COVID-19 that have been confirmed here in the Midwest have been associated with agriculture and associated with these large-scale meat processing plants. And so one of the things I think that people didn't anticipate about a virus of this nature coming through was that it's so contagious that it's not a matter of the illness from the virus just increasing absenteeism. I looked at a couple of models of the impacts of pandemics on the food system, and they were talking about, okay, what level of absenteeism? Will there be 10% of the people out of work, or 25% of the people that don't show up? And what they didn't anticipate, like in this case, the virus is so contagious that before you get 10% of the people infected in a packing plant, you have to close down the whole plant. And some of these plants, like, hire thousands of people. I think one of them is 3,700 people. So they had, 100, 150 people showed up infected, and they closed the whole plant. Well, when you close a plant of that size, that basically is killing thousands of animals, in this case hogs every day, millions a year, something like 4 to 5% of the total pork supply in the country coming out of this one plant. Then you see you've got this huge specialized plant. What it does is slaughter and process hogs into pork. And you have a virus outbreak that you have to close the whole plant. Well, if you had to close a half dozen of those plants, and there's probably a half dozen that are infected to one extent or another, then you've disrupted the whole system. And I think another thing that's being revealed is that at a time when you have scarcity in some parts of the food system, you have surplus in others, because the food system lacks the flexibility to shift from one to another. It's a highly specialized kind of system. So I recently saw a case where they'd come in the contract laying operation, egg producing operation, that they had 60-some thousand chickens, laying hens. And the company that they contracted with had come in and euthanized the whole flock and killed the whole flock with gas, because this was a particular market that went into liquid eggs. That's where the eggs were going, to go into restaurants and institutions. Well, when you had the pandemic that closed the restaurants and institutions, then it cut off this particular market, but there was no flexibility to move those eggs into another market. Whereas at the same time, you have egg prices in the grocery stores that have remained open are going up, and there's a scarcity of eggs in a grocery store, but you're killing chickens over here because the system doesn't have the flexibility to move eggs that were scheduled to go into liquid production into, selling as fresh eggs. And
yes,
another example is,
oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it seems like that's happening also with the produce market and with the milk market.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. We got people that are pouring out milk, and you'd think, well, you could put that into cheese. That would be a very good way to take care of the milk. But when they close the restaurants, a big portion of the cheese goes through the restaurant, and the pizza primarily is where most people eat a lot of the cheese. And so when the restaurants close down, then all of a sudden there's no demand for the cheese side of it, and there's no place to put the excess milk that's being produced, and a lot of that would have gone through schools and institutions, and a lot of those are closed down, and they don't have the flexibility to move that into the retail trade rather than it going where they had it scheduled for cheese. And so what we have here is we hear these stories about a food system that's very fragile in a sense, and I think the more technical term would, it lacks resilience. It lacks the ability to either withstand or quickly rebound to or adjust to some unexpected shock in the system. Even if you know that these disturbances are going to occur periodically, particularly if they don't occur very often, then if you don't have a good bit of resilience built into the system overall, then you're hit with one of these disturbances, one of these shocks, one of these crises, and the whole system begins to collapse. Now, hopefully the whole food system isn't going to collapse this time, but one of the things that's happened, and we kind of got into a habit, is that what happens when the physical part of the system begins to fall apart, then it begins to affect the economic system. And then you have people unemployed, and you have people that can't get food. We've got—
Yes, let's talk about that a minute, because a couple things we haven't talked about are, well, we did talk about labor, or you talked about labor in the meat packing plant, but what about labor, picking labor? And then the other interesting thing to me is international trade, and thinking about how much of our commodity crops have been going overseas and how much we also import. And it just seems like it's really difficult to predict how that will all settle out, but there are certainly lots of changes happening on the international level as well.
Yeah, and on the international level, the major repercussions may be sort of in the future as the pandemic moves into some of these countries that we import a great deal from. For example, like Mexico, a lot of our vegetables and fruits come from South America. So far, the pandemic hasn't hit as hard there as it has in Europe and Asia. And so when it hits in those particular places and those sources of production close down, then again, we don't have the adaptability to make up for what we're importing in terms of fruits and vegetables from other countries. If you look overall, about 15% of our total food supplies come from other countries. And we export something like 20% of the overall production at the farm level. It's a higher percentage depending on export, but when you look at, the food value that we're importing. But if you look at fruits and vegetables, then the percentage is much higher for vegetables. I think it's closer to 30 or 40%, and over half of our fruits come from other areas. Don't quote me on the exact percentages, but there's available on the internet. But we're highly dependent on those areas. We're also highly dependent here in the U.S. in domestic production for fruits and vegetables on California and Florida. A large portion of our total production comes from California. So if you have a big processing plant go down in California, and fruit or vegetable processing plant, then it's going to have a big impact to Florida. Or if you have an outbreak among the mostly migrant workers that are harvest the crops in Florida or in California, then you have a major disruption in the system. And again, that's because what we've done is we've created a food system based on efficiency of operation, but also economic efficiency. And so when you move toward efficiency, we followed the industrial approach to increasing efficiency. We talk about the whole industrial era of development. It's about this particular kind of approach or model of achieving economic productivity and economic efficiency, or physical productivity and economic efficiency. And it's about specializing in particular commodities, particular phases of production, as we moved away from diversified farms, for example, and we've gone to specialized crop or livestock farm, then specialize in one particular production, like we were talking about the hogs and chickens, one phase of it's on the farm, or a particular crop. You specialize, and then you can standardize those specialized operations so that you can mechanize them, you routinize them. And that's what we see in the packing plants. It's a specialized, it's producing one particular commodity. It's producing pork, beef, chicken. When I was in the meat packing business, my first job out of college in the 1960s, I went to work with Wilson Meat Packing Company, the fourth largest meat packer in the country. Back then you had multi-species plants where the same processing plant would slaughter cattle, hogs, not chicken, but sheep, and multi-species. Now it's specializing in that one particular species. And then you can run that like an assembly line. In fact, we used to refer to slaughter plants as disassembly lines. You run it like a factory, that's like you're assembling an automobile, but you're disassembling.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that a minute, because even if the system weren't fragile, there's obviously deep ethical and sustainability questions about these massive operations, their impact on the planet, and sort of, again, the ethical impact of CAFOs. And so even if we weren't looking at the fragility, it does seem like it's probably not sustainable for the long term, just in terms of environmental issues.
Well, it's not sustainable on a whole range of fronts. And what this particular crisis is pointing out is a particular dimension of the lack of sustainability. So you've got this, we're making agriculture production food run like an assembly line, like a factory. So you standardize all those processes. And the reason I wanted to get in that, the reason they have such problems in the processing plants is the people on these lines that they've got disassembling these animals are standing shoulder to shoulder. There's no possibility of moving them 6 feet apart because the line's designed for these activities to take place. So it's standardized, specialized, and then you can consolidate. That's what we get into large scale. So the lack of resilience is inherent within that approach to production, which is about specializing, standardizing, consolidating into large control. You end up with a very economically efficient system that can turn out, all kinds of cheap, let's say cheap, convenient food products, but it's very fragile. It's very.
Would you see parallels in our commodity crops like corn and soy? Are there parallels in terms of the fragility?
Absolutely. We have the very same characteristics in crop production that we have in livestock production. All the standardization, we end up with the same genetics, one breed or two breeds, and at most there are varieties of a crop in particular, which makes them susceptible to diseases. We had the corn blight, that's been 20, 30 years ago, but a disease like that could come back again and wipe out a big share of the crop. Or we could have a bacterial pandemic, and we're running into really issues now. We've got a lot of antibiotic resistant bacteria primarily coming out of the livestock operations, where you have the large confinement animals, and they're so close together they create ideal breeding ground for antibiotic resistance because they're feeding them low levels of antibiotic. But we're subject to a pandemic of antibiotic resistant bacteria, and much of the bacteria contamination that we've seen so far, where we've had outbreaks that wouldn't be called a pandemic, have come through vegetables, have come through the fruit and vegetable line, as opposed to coming through the livestock line. So that whole sector, the plant sector of the food system is just as vulnerable to the effects of a pandemic as the livestock sector is, and we may well see that. It's just that the viruses tend to spread more among animals, among living things. Plants are living things too, but the bacterial contaminations can go either way.
So if you were able to wave a magic wand and design a resilient food system for our country, at least, what are some of the areas that you would focus on?
Well, I think the reason I kind of explained how the system works that we have now is that if you want to build a resilient system, rather than having to respond and come in an emergency situation and deal with the crises, then you would go a different direction. Rather than having a highly specialized system, then you would have a flexible system that, rather than specializing in just one crop, like on farms nowadays, we've gone to specialization. You'd go to where you had more than one crop. You had a diversity of crops, but give you the flexibility then, if you have a problem in one of the crops, that you can shift to another. And the whole food system would be designed so that you wouldn't have these specialized sectors where you can't move product from one area to the other. In other words, it would be set up so if there's a problem within the restaurant trade, you can shift to products that would go into the grocery store. If there's a problem somewhere else, you can move around. You'd have the flexibility and adaptability. And rather than having the standardized kind of system, you'd have a diversity of varieties and diversity of food, so that if you had a particular disease or particular bacteria or whatever, and it affected one species or one part of the system, then you're not totally dependent upon that you've got other alternatives that you can go to, and then a system that wouldn't be consolidated. And then if you want to a diverse kind of system that was flexible, then it's going to be more difficult to manage, and you're not going to be consolidating into larger and larger operations. And the other thing is that you'd be more geographically dispersed as well, rather than specializing in particular areas, because we're as vulnerable to a crisis caused by a breakdown in the transportation system or the communication system or the electrical grid as we are to diseases, because we have a system that's very productive and very economically efficient, but it's also very fragile. And the point I was going to make a while ago is the only reason that we've been able to continue with this system is that whenever there is a crisis, whenever there's a problem with the system, it's basically they call upon society to bail them out. It gets reflected in an economic crisis, unemployment, or that we have to close down plants or whatever. But invariably then, it comes back to the taxpayer then to come back and allocate government funds, whether it's through emergency programs for farmers that have been hit by a flood or a drought or something like that, or whether it's the funds that we're seeing now that are going to the processing plants and the restaurants to pay for people that have been laid off. And so it comes back then upon the government, upon the taxpayer, on the people to offset that lack of resilience in the system.
So you're saying that we as taxpayers have been subsidizing this system.
Sure.
Are there ways that we can subsidize the right kind of systems, John?
Did somebody subsidize the what?
The right kind of systems, or are
Yeah,
there
we ought to be supporting the transition to a system that would be more resilient. And before the focus on all of the pandemic, the emphasis in agriculture primarily was on regeneration. It was on the climate change. We got another long-term crisis that we're dealing with at the same time, the short term. Well, you could go through the whole litany that I've gone through here and show how the current system's not regenerative. It's not self-renewing. So we need to be using our government programs rather than propping up this failed system. This system we have now, the industrial system, is tremendously efficient, but it's tremendously risky. And so the taxpayers have been offsetting the risk. Like taxpayers pay more than 60% of the cost of the crop insurance that these large-scale crop producers have to have in order to make it possible for them to go out and plant thousands of acres and to invest millions of dollars in equipment. If we weren't
last year, I think insurance was a big part of farmers' income last year because of the floods. So
we've gone to more and more to insurance as a support, but we're subsidizing that. So my real concern, and what I'm writing about now that I'm working on a blog piece, the long-term concern is, like we saw this case, we had a delay in responding to it because they knew that the economic impact of doing what we needed to do to shut down was going to be a major negative economic impact on the economy overall. So there was a reluctance to do it. There was a reluctance to do it in China, and there was a reluctance to do it in this country. And I would argue it's because if they closed down and then it turned out not to be such a big deal, they would have had a major negative economic impact. And so they put priority on the economics. And then also you see over time, we had a crisis early on. We had the Ebola crisis or whatever, but if it goes away for a while, we'll probably build some redundancy into the medical system and rebuild the stocks of medical equipment and the PPE, protective equipment and things like that. But over time, if there isn't another crisis, then it's not economical to maintain and replenish those stocks, and that's the reason they don't do it. So what a big concern is that we could hit a crisis where we respond too little or too late, and then the whole system collapses. And then you've got a major panic. We see a little glimpse of that when you see cars lined up for blocks on TV.
Yeah, I think it's actually bigger than a little glimpse. My sense is that people are really going to be ready to think about regionalizing of food systems. Right. Can you let us give us your sense of what some of the bright spots are on the horizon in terms of possibilities, whether they're models, economic models of regionalized food systems, maybe policies that we could be thinking about?
Right. I think there, on the bright side, the hopefulness is that you talked about me working in sustainable agriculture. I really got involved in the late 80s, started thinking about it in the mid 80s, got involved in the late 80s. So I've been involved in this for quite a long time. But the people that I've been working with during that period of time have been rebuilding or have been building or creating the alternative to this industrial system. Practically everything that's been driving the changes that you've seen in the food system, the rise of organic basically was a rejection of the industrialization of the food system. Now, it's being kind of co-opted to a great extent by the industrial food system. There's always an attempt to do that. But the real organic, and there's still a project called the Real Organic Project that's fighting the
regenerative label.
Yeah, it's regenerative is coming along more and more, but there's a whole range of not just organic, but biodynamic agriculture, agroecology, permaculture, ecological farming, holistic resource management, nature farming. There's just a whole range of alternative kind of approaches that have the characteristics that I've talked about. Rather than being specialized, they're holistic, they're diverse, they're regenerative, they're resilient. At the same time, they're efficient, they're resourceful, they're flexible, they're dynamic. All these systems are here, but they don't fit the industrial system of processing and distribution of food. And so most of the sales so far out of the authentic, what I would call authentic sustainable, all those are about creating a sustainable system that's regenerative, resourceful, that's also resilient, that's capable of maintaining its productivity. All of those systems have been moving in the same direction, but they basically had to create their own access to markets to their own local customers. And you hear more about farmers markets and CSAs, which have grown considerably over the years. And now you hear more about food hubs where collections of farmers are coming together and alliances and things of this nature. So there's a whole alternative model that's being developed out here. And it's not limited in scale in terms of maintaining its integrity. There's an organization in the United Kingdom, in England, called Riverford Organic. And if you go online and Google Riverford Organic, you see they're delivering something like 47,000 boxes of vegetables and meat, milk and eggs, food a week. And they're delivering it from farms in a particular area of England to customers in that particular area. And this is just the overall kind of the umbrella that connects all these people and allows you to go online and order from producers in your particular area.
So it's connecting technological innovation with localized production. Yeah,
with localized production. They're going out, the farms are all localized out here and they're using the technological innovation. And I think there's an opportunity now to, particularly to go online. And many of the farmers markets have already gone online. First thing I wrote in response is, here's an opportunity for farmers markets to do what they should have been doing all along, is to have an online option, not replace the in-person farmers markets when it's convenient or whenever you have an opportunity to go and interact with the farmer, but being able to go online and still get products, not only in a time of crisis like this, which many of them are already doing, but also if you have a rainy Saturday or a late spring, cool spring, or you have people that just can't go to the market on a regular basis, but they go when they can. Well, if they could go online when they can't get to the market, then they could depend on the market overall. So there's an opportunity there. I think the thing I'd really like to get across is one advantage of being old is I can remember when things weren't like they are today. When I was growing up, we had a local food system. We didn't have supermarkets. There was no self-serve supermarket anywhere. We had grocery stores. Even the store we went to, you took your grocery list in and you didn't get anything off the shelf. You give it to a clerk and they went and got it and brought it back to you and put it in what we called a paper poke and totaled it up, told you what you got. We didn't have franchise restaurants. We didn't have industrial agriculture. We had an old steam engine that went from one farm to the other to pull the threshing machine, but it was followed by teams of horses that were doing the rest of it. So all of these changes that we're talking about to the system we have now, by and large, they happened in a period of about 40 to 50 years, between the 60s and the 90s. A big part of the industrialization of the old system. Now, there's been changes in the past 20 years, but we haven't changed the system fundamentally during that period of time. We just did more of the same. And the good point is that the alternative to the industrial food system is further advanced in terms of really knowing how to produce food and knowing that we could produce enough good food for everybody in this country, and we can produce enough good food for everybody in the world with these alternative systems.
I think there is a sort of misconception that big farms feed the world, where that is not true.
Yeah, and that's part of what they promote, because they think, well, you're going to have to keep subsidizing us. You're going to have to keep putting up with the lack of resilience, the lack of regenerative, because you don't have an alternative. It's simply not true. As you said, the UN reports and global reports everywhere. You just don't see them. Food and agriculture organizations and others indicate that 70 to 80% of the people in the world are not fed by industrial agriculture. They're fed by small family farms. Probably half of those farms that are feeding people we would call subsistence farms. And we know from research, and particularly what I talked about, agroecology, and there's also a global food sovereignty movement that's talking about relocalizing. We know from the research that's been done in these areas that these farmers that are feeding 70, 80% of the people in the country could double or triple their production without going to industrial agriculture, going to holistic resource management, agroecology, organic systems, ecological systems. And the farms would maybe slightly larger, but they're still small, they're still diverse. And the agroecology and the other science that's behind what they're doing here in terms of research is supportive of this concept of relocalization, which I think is a key part of creating a sustainable food system, is to relocalize, to decentralize. Like I said, the third phase of industrialization is consolidation, which brings stuff together into large scale. So if you want to go the other direction, you decentralize, you move out, you reestablish, independent decision makers within individual communities, and then you connect those communities so that you have a network rather than this industrialized sort of factory. Right now, we have a model of a food factory with all the different pieces and all the different parts that are specialized to do different things. And what we're talking about is replacing that with a food network. But that whole system and all of the thinking and the research foundation and the know-how is much further advanced than the industrial food system was when I was a kid. I mean, we're so much further along. Nobody had a clue when they started industrializing the food system that we'd end up with what we got today. I mean,
so tell us, for those of us who are really interested in changing things beyond buying local food, supporting our local farmers, what are some things that we can do as citizens to help not prop up the current system, but help to rebuild the new?
Well, I think you have to act at two different levels, and I consistently say this. I'm convinced that we each have a purpose. There's some reason for us being here. I don't think life makes any sense, if we don't have a purpose. And I personally think that our purpose here is to do something worthwhile, to do something good. I don't think human beings are here on Earth to destroy everything and to depopulate it. We're in the process of trying to create an environment that's unlivable for humans, but I don't think that's the intent. So if we start from this, then we look and say, what can I do in my particular community, in my particular place, in my particular sphere of influence? Rather than saying all of the things that need to be done, most of those you can't do and I can't do. But there are a whole range of things that we can do. And if we have in mind, this is what needs to be done, and this is what I can do to help move it in that direction, whether it's buying at the local farmer's market or helping somebody get organized, or whether it's becoming a farmer ourselves, or whether it's starting a cooperative, or I'm trying to promote the idea of community food utilities, or whatever it is that we can do individually, that we can go out and do it, and it can make a difference within our sphere of influence, then we have a responsibility to do that. But we also need to be aware that the food system that we have today, contrary to what's popularly promoted, is not a consequence just of the free market moving in that direction. Now, in terms of agriculture, it was the technologies that came out of World War II primarily. We were moving toward mechanization, industrialization, but the big move that I talked about between the 60s and the 90s, we had the technologies that came out of World War II, the chemical fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers came from munitions plants, and the pesticides out of the chemical warfare, and the mechanization, the cheap tractors that finally got cheap enough and well enough. That came out of making Jeeps and tanks. They've shifted over to making tractors. And so the technology was there, and that made it possible. But what made it inevitable is we had that fundamental change in farm policy and food policy, where the government supported that trend. We have been absorbing the risk of moving toward this industrial food system ever since it started, back in the 40s and 50s.
So do you see policy changes that people can support? Sorry.
Yeah, so there's a movement now, and we can support those at the local, at the federal level, but there's a movement at the federal level. For the first time in this presidential campaign, there were major candidates, and still major candidates, that were talking about fundamental major changes in farm policy that would support a transition from industrial agriculture to sustainable agriculture, whether it's about breaking up the big corporations that have a stranglehold now on this corporate industrial food system. That's what's driving policy right now. It's not the people. The people are kind of been led to believe that they're supporting independent family farms and a viable, diverse, regenerative, resourceful, resilient food system. We got the best food system in the world. But that's coming out of the propaganda and the political influence of the large corporations. So whether it's breaking those up or moving toward, there was a legislative proposal that got quite a bit of publicity called the Green New Deal. Well, there's a whole section in there on agricultural policy and that talks about transition to a sustainable regenerative agriculture and helping farmers make the transition. There are specific policy proposals out here. I've worked with an organization called Data for Progress and with a bunch of young people. The primary author was 23 years old. But, they put together a real strong agenda of regenerative agriculture and the Green New Deal, and they're out promoting it all across the country. So for the first time, I see major candidates at the national level talking about fundamental change in farm policy that would move us in the direction. So acting locally, doing what we can do there, informing ourselves on the policy initiatives, whether that gets passed or whether the candidates that are supported get elected. It's a reflection of people who understand the political pulse of the country, that they perceive that there is a public concern about the food system and there's sufficient public support for change that they're willing to run their presidential campaign on it. It's the realization that the public is awakening. That's the important, rather than just the political message. But we can support that. So I see real possibilities for a hope as we move into the future, sort of making this transformation. But we need, I'd say the most important thing for us individually and collectively is to understand that the economy is simply meant to be a means to allow us to do something else. The economy itself was never meant to be the end result. Economic growth was never meant to be the fundamental driving force of any society. It's the economic growth so that you can do something that's important with the economic benefits that accrue from that. And we need to stop and think about what it is that we want. What kind of country do we want? What kind of relationships do we want? What kind of community do we want? How do we
You're getting into your deep sustainability.
Yeah,
but I think this is where people are now, and it's who knows what the entire fallout of all this is going to be. But I do feel that people are awakening not just to the fragility of our systems, but also a question about why we have them and why do we think we need endless growth. Absolutely. And on and on. So I think it's a really important time for people like you to be out talking and writing. So I'm so glad that you are.
Well, I believe that individually and collectively, we need to rethink what's this all about. And my point is, it's not about economics. It was never intended to be. It has become that because I think we've substituted economics for a purpose. We've assumed that if we had more money, on the one hand, if we had more money, we could do whatever we wanted to, so we don't think about what it is we really need it for. And I tell people, if you don't know what you need money for, you'll never have enough, because you always think, but if you really know what you want to do with your life, you've got enough money to do that, you don't need any more money. So we need to think about that. But we need to think about that as a country. What kind of country does we want to be, and how big economy do we need, and this sort of thing. And we cannot continue to allow economics to drive the rest of the system. We cannot continue to sacrifice human well-being in terms of lives. I've even seen statements made that I think one high-level state official said we ought to ask old people if they wouldn't rather go ahead and die so that their kids could have a stronger economy. I said, you ought to ask the kids if they want their grandparents, if they want to let their grandparents die. But I mean, when people are asking questions like that, it says our priorities are all wrong. We need to look at the economy and economic efficiency as a means of doing something else. We need to look at that in our own lives, and then we need to look at it as a nation, and then we'll reorient our priorities where we're not simply looking at the most efficient food system, but we're looking at one that's resilient and regenerative and resourceful, and it can carry on and be productive indefinitely for the benefit of future generations and everybody.
Thank you so much for that, John. And I know you blog at johnikerd.com. Are there other blogs or presentations you'd like to alert people to if they're interested in learning more about your work?
Yeah, I have a Facebook page where I post quite a few things. And then also, if you go to the johnikerd.com website on the homepage, there's a link to my University of Missouri website. I still have University of Missouri. I have a professor emeritus status, University of Missouri. That's the website. It's got a longer URL to it. So if you go there and click on where it says University of Missouri website, there's basically hundreds of papers that I've posted on there from presentations I've made over the past 30 years. So
great. Well, it seems to me we'll have to have another conversation focused on economics, because that's a whole, really even a bigger topic than agriculture. So thank you so much for joining us today, John.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and maybe I can make it out to Yellow Springs one of these days when we come with this crisis and are on the other side. So keep up the good work.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care now.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.